We move on to cardiac work, and cardiac work basically is of two types. One is volume work, and the other is pressure work. Simply put, volume work is the amount of work, the effort that is required or it's done by the heart in the physical throwing or ejection of blood into the ventricles. This is happens when the aortic valves, if we are talking about the left ventricle work. So let's take that as an example because it does more work because it is connected to the systemic circulation and all that. So when it throws its blood, its stroke volume from inside the ventricle into the aorta after the opening of the aortic valve, that work, that component of the work, which is a fraction of the total work, of course, that is called the volume work. Okay. This work is made possible by this work, which is the pressure work. So if you just go through your cardiac cycle in your mind now, right now, and you just remember what happens during isovolumetric contraction, just before ejection, what happens when the ventricle is contracting in a closed chamber with all the valves closed? What is happening there? You're stretching the elastic tissues, you're overcoming internal viscosities, you are literally rearranging the musculature of the heart so that, and remember, the chamber is closed. Okay, so whatever is happening in the spot, it's happening with the lid down. Okay, it's all cooking inside with all lids, all valves closed. So this work is designed to increase pressure before you can eject blood at a higher velocity. For you to be able to do that, eject blood at higher velocity, you need to mount a lot of pressure within a closed chamber. This is called pressure work. Okay, pressure work. So pressure work happens first, and then volume work happens. If you just follow the cardiac cycle, the basic cardiac cycle. Now, these two concepts have implications. Okay, and the number one implication is for oxygen consumption. So pressure work, we say, is more quote unquote expensive than volume work. Okay. Uh, it's said in another way, it's a very interesting way of saying it, is that if you increase afterload, that will cause a greater consumption of oxygen by the myocardium than it would have happened if you had increased preload. Now, let me just talk a bit about this. What is afterload and what is preload is something that you need to understand, obviously, before attempting to understand this concept. Afterload is, as we have been talking, is the pressure against which the ventricle is contracting. Okay, so basically blood pressure inside the aorta or the situation of the aortic valve. If it's stenotic, if it's narrowed, then you know, or if there is hypertension in the person, then we say that afterload has increased. Okay, what is preload? Preload is the amount of blood that is coming by venous return into the heart. So that's done. Now we are saying that the myocardial oxygen consumption gets enhanced. It requires more oxygen, comes under a load. The coronaries go in overdrive, trying to get enough oxygen to this myocardium. If the afterload increases as compared to preload, of course, if we increase the preload, Frank's Starling law dictates that the heart will contract more. But when we compare afterload and preload, very important point here is if we increase afterload, uh, for each degree increase in afterload, the increase in oxygen consumption will be much more than each degree increase in preload. So the heart is actually happy dealing with more blood coming in and it's happy to contract and get rid of it. Then when it has to contract against an increased aortic pressure or against a stenotic aortic valve. Yes, so that's a very important point. That pressure work uh, 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 makes you pay much more than volume work. Okay, the Frank-Starling law versus this increased afterload scenario can be used in MCQs and Viva questions. It's a very interesting point. And by using this, now the question which you will be hopefully answering in the comment section below this video is this scenario. In angina, and angina is basically ischemic pain in the myocardium. It's a prelude to infarction. So when there is not enough oxygen delivery to the myocardium becomes ischemic. Ischemia is a painful situation, whether it's in the myocardium or elsewhere. And that is the pain that you get with a heart attack. So that's called angina. So which one, aortic stenosis or aortic regurgitation, would produce more angina? Okay, angina we have defined here. I'll wait for your comments. Uh, and let's see who gets it right. So this is one important thing, one important concept. And the second is, again, it draws upon what we were discussing, the Frank-Starling law versus sympathetic stimulation, which has implications for what in terms of cardiac work. Okay, so load enhancement, i.e., if we are talking about Frank-Starling law, just remember, don't be bogged down by this long term here. We are basically talking about Frank-Starling law. We are basically talking about preload increase. Okay, so oxygen consumption increases when you increase stroke volume by increasing preload. Remember, there are other ways of increasing stroke volume as well. The other way is enhancing the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, that's another way. And by increasing the preload, increasing the amount of blood via venous return is also a way of increasing stroke volume. So there are two ways of increasing stroke volume. And if you're looking at the oxygen consumption via this way, via increasing the preload, the law of Laplace comes back and visits you. Okay, if you remember, we talked about law of Laplace when we were talking about wall tension, when we were talking about myogenic mechanism or autoregulation during the local blood flow control chapter of circulation. Okay, and it says that the wall tension basically, if you stretch a vessel, if you stretch it, the radius increases, the tension developed in the wall increases, and so does the oxygen consumption. Okay, this is basically law of Laplace. So when the preload increases, i.e., the venous return increases, it stretches the myocardium and the ventricle. The radius increases, the tension developed increases, and oxygen consumption also increases. Okay. Now, this opposed to sympathetic stimulation. So in this sympathetic stimulation, we know that the heart is stimulated to not only increase the number of contractions, but each contraction, the amount of force that it develops also increases. We call this thing contractility. Remember, contractility is a distinct quality of the myocardium. It's not contraction, it's contractility. Contractility is basically conceptually the force of each contraction. And sympathetic stimulation has this ability to increase that force of contraction by enhancing the calcium sensitivity of the myocardium. So it does not mess with the radius or the stretch. Yes, it basically increases cardiac performance by manipulating calcium. So it does not deal with the stretching and the radius and all that stuff. Hence, the oxygen consumption, as compared to oxygen consumption by increasing preload, in increasing contractility by the sympathetics, the oxygen consumption is lesser, more efficient than loading induced contraction via the Frank-Starling law. Okay, let me give you some perspective here quickly. This here we discussed overall, we compared afterload with preload. Yes. So this slide we discussed, if you increase the afterload or if you increase the preload, which one will cost you more oxygen? And we said increased afterload is more expensive. So more heart attacks happen, more pressure comes on the heart when you increase afterload. Here we are discussing that in the we are now not discussing afterload. We are discussing that if you were to increase stroke volume and the afterload is constant, which one of which two ways are there to increase stroke volume? We said one is the Frank-Starling law, which we say that increase the preload, and the second is sympathetic stimulation induced enhanced contractility. Now, in this slide, we compare these two. Which one is more oxygen efficient? And we said now you get the context here. So here we said that Frank-Starling law induced um, contraction, stroke in enhancing stroke volume, basically because of Laplace law leads to more oxygen consumption than a mechanism which does not enhance the stretch or radius. It enhances the quality of the contraction itself by making the myocardium more calcium responsive. Okay, so this is also has direct implications on the quality of work that the heart performs.